Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutal realities of marriage in ancient China, where love was a luxury, survival was a skill, and your wedding day might just be the beginning of your worst nightmare. From foot binding to forced concubinage, from mother-in-law tyranny to the ever-present threat of being sold like livestock, ancient Chinese marriage was less about romance and more about endurance. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're 12 years old, maybe 13 if you're lucky, and your parents have just informed you that tomorrow you'll be married to a man you've never met. A man who's twice your age, lives 3 villages away, and whose family has already paid your bride price in silver and rice. You have no say in the matter. You never did. From the moment you were born, your fate was sealed not by destiny, but by economics, politics, and a social system so rigid it made prison walls look flexible. Welcome to marriage in ancient China, where your wedding wasn't a celebration of love, but a business transaction. Where your spouse wasn't your partner, but your owner, and where your new family wasn't gaining a daughter, but acquiring property that breathed, worked, and if they were lucky, produced sons. The marriage system was built on 3 fundamental pillars that would crush your modern sensibilities like a house of cards. First, absolute filial piety, meaning your duty to your parents trumped everything, including your own happiness, health, and sometimes even your life. Second, rigid gender hierarchy, where women were considered inferior to men in every conceivable way, legally, socially, economically, and spiritually. And third, the continuation of the family line, which meant your primary value was measured by your ability to produce male heirs, and if you couldn't do that, well, you were essentially worthless. Now I know what you're thinking. Surely there were exceptions. Surely some marriages were happy. Surely some families were kind. And yes, there were exceptions, rare as they were. But the system itself was so fundamentally oppressive that even the kindest families operated within a framework that would horrify you. The most loving husband still owned his wife legally. The most benevolent mother-in-law still held absolute power over her daughter-in-law. The most progressive family still valued sons over daughters without question. Let's start with something that might seem romantic at first glance, the matchmaking process. In your world, you swipe right, go on dates, fall in love, and maybe eventually decide to get married. In ancient China, you were matched by professional matchmakers who evaluated your family's wealth, your father's connections, your potential fertility, and your ability to serve your future in-laws without complaint. Love wasn't just irrelevant, it was suspicious. A couple who claimed to love each other before marriage was viewed with the same skepticism we might reserve for someone claiming they could talk to ghosts. The matchmaker, usually an older woman with an encyclopedic knowledge of local families, would visit your parents with proposals. She'd examine your face for signs of good breeding, check your hands for evidence of hard work, and assess your demeanor for proper submissiveness. You weren't consulted. You weren't even necessarily informed until the deal was struck. Your parents would negotiate bride price, dowry, wedding expenses, and the terms of your future servitude, all while you continued your daily life blissfully unaware that your fate was being decided over tea and rice cakes. And here's the kicker. The better your family's financial situation, the more likely you were to be married off young. Wealthy families couldn't risk their daughters becoming too educated, too opinionated, or too aware of their own worth. Poor families couldn't afford to feed you much longer. Either way, childhood ended abruptly, usually somewhere between your 10th and 15th birthday, when you traded your parents' house for your husband's and your childhood dreams for adult nightmares. But the matchmaking was just the beginning. Once your marriage was arranged, the real preparation began. And by preparation, I mean a systematic process designed to transform you from an individual human being into a perfectly compliant wife, daughter-in-law, and baby-making machine. This wasn't education, it was programming, and it was ruthless. For girls, this preparation often included foot binding, a practice so barbaric that describing it accurately might make you physically ill. When you were between 4 and 7 years old, your feet would be tightly wrapped with cloth strips after your toes had been broken and folded under your feet. The goal was to create tiny, 3-inch feet called lotus feet, which were considered the ultimate symbol of feminine beauty and status. But the reality was months of excruciating pain, permanent disability, and a lifetime of being unable to walk properly, run, or escape. The process was deliberate. Bound feet weren't just about beauty, they were about control. A woman with bound feet couldn't work in the fields, couldn't travel long distances, and couldn't run away from an abusive marriage. She was literally hobbled, made dependent on others for her most basic needs. And the more helpless she was, the more desirable she became to potential suitors. It was disability as dowry, suffering as status symbol. Boys had their own brutal preparation, but it was different. They were groomed to be masters, not servants. They learned to read and write, studied classical literature, and were taught that their future wives existed solely to serve them, bear their children, and obey their every command without question. They learned that showing affection to their wives was weakness, that treating women as equals was shameful, and that their primary loyalty should always be to their parents, not their spouses. This created a generation of young men who viewed marriage not as partnership, but as ownership, not as cooperation, but as domination. And when these psychologically programmed boys married these physically and emotionally broken girls, the results were predictably disastrous for everyone involved, except perhaps the parents who had successfully offloaded their financial responsibilities onto the next generation. The wedding itself was a masterclass in symbolism over substance. Everything about the ceremony reinforced the power dynamics that would define your married life. The bride wore red, symbolizing luck and fertility, but also marking her as the property being transferred from one family to another. She was carried to the ceremony in a sedan chair, unable to walk on her bound feet, completely dependent on others, even for basic transportation to her own wedding. During the ceremony, the bride and groom didn't exchange vows of love, mutual respect, or partnership. Instead, they performed elaborate rituals of submission and hierarchy. The bride bowed to her new parents-in-law, symbolically accepting their authority over her life. She served tea to her husband's relatives in order of seniority, learning her place in the family pecking order. She received jewelry and gifts that belonged not to her, but to her new family, marking her as their investment, not their daughter. The groom, meanwhile, was celebrated as the new master of a household asset. His friends congratulated him on his acquisition. His parents praised him for fulfilling his duty. His new wife was discussed like a prize horse, valuable for breeding and labor, but not particularly important as an individual. The entire celebration revolved around what she could do for the family, never what the family could do for her. After the ceremony came the wedding night, and here's where things get particularly dark. In your world, a wedding night is ideally about two people who love each other sharing an intimate moment. In ancient China, it was about a terrified girl, often still a child, being sexually assaulted by a stranger while his family waited outside to examine the bedsheets for proof of her virginity. If there was no blood, she could be sent back to her family in disgrace, branded as impure, and potentially unmarriageable for life. The concept of consent didn't exist. The idea that a wife might not want sexual relations with her husband was incomprehensible. Marital rape wasn't just legal, it was expected. A wife who refused her husband's advances could be beaten, divorced, or even killed without legal consequence. Her body belonged to him as completely as his livestock or his furniture, and he was entitled to use it however he saw fit. But even if the wedding night went according to plan, by ancient Chinese standards, the real horror was just beginning. Because now you had to survive living with your new in-laws, and they held absolute power over every aspect of your existence. In ancient Chinese society, when you married, you didn't just gain a husband, you joined his extended family, and in that family, you ranked somewhere below the livestock and slightly above the furniture. The hierarchy was strict, unforgiving, and designed to ensure that you, as the newest and youngest female member, had absolutely no power, no voice, and no recourse when things went wrong. At the top of this hierarchy sat your husband's father, the patriarch, whose word was literally law within the household. Below him was your husband's mother, your new mother-in-law, who would become either your protector or your worst nightmare, and unfortunately, she was far more likely to be the latter. Then came your husband's older brothers and their wives, your husband himself, any unmarried siblings, and finally, at the very bottom of this pecking order, you. Your mother-in-law held particular power over your life, and she wielded it with the enthusiasm of someone who had once been in your position and was now finally getting her chance for revenge. She controlled your daily schedule, decided what you ate, determined how you dressed, and monitored your every interaction with other family members. She could work you from dawn to dusk, beat you for imagined infractions, and humiliate you in front of the entire household, all while your husband nodded approvingly or simply looked the other way. This wasn't accidental cruelty. It was systematic oppression designed to break your spirit and ensure your complete compliance. Your mother-in-law had survived this same treatment decades earlier, and now she was passing it down like a twisted family heirloom. The system perpetuated itself by turning victims into victimizers, ensuring that each generation of women would inflict the same suffering on the next. Your daily life was a series of tests, challenges, and humiliations designed to reinforce your status as the family's lowest-ranking member. You woke before dawn to prepare breakfast for the entire household, serving everyone else before you were allowed to eat. You cleaned, cooked, and did laundry using methods that would break your back and destroy your hands. You tended to sick family members, cared for elderly relatives, and performed any other labor the family required, all without payment, thanks, or even basic recognition of your humanity. And if you thought your husband might protect you from his family's abuse, you were tragically mistaken. In ancient Chinese culture, a man's loyalty to his parents always superseded his obligations to his wife. If his mother complained about you, he was expected to discipline you. If his father criticized your work, he was supposed to make you work harder. If his siblings mocked you, he was meant to join in or at least remain silent. Defending his wife against his family wasn't just discouraged, it was seen as a betrayal of filial piety, one of the most serious moral failings in Chinese society. This meant you were truly alone in a house full of people who viewed you as an outsider, a servant, and a potential threat to their family harmony. You had no allies, no advocates, and no escape routes. Your own family had essentially sold you and couldn't take you back without losing face. Your husband's family owned you legally and socially, and the broader community would side with your in-laws in any dispute, because maintaining family hierarchy was more important than individual justice. The psychological impact of this isolation was devastating. Imagine being surrounded by people every moment of your life, yet feeling completely alone. Imagine having every decision made for you, every movement monitored, every word scrutinized for signs of disrespect or rebellion. Imagine knowing that your slightest mistake could result in punishment, that your greatest successes would go unrecognized, and that your deepest fears and sorrows had to be hidden behind a mask of grateful servitude. Many young wives in ancient China developed what we might now recognize as severe depression, anxiety, and trauma responses. They became withdrawn, fearful, and hypervigilant, constantly scanning their environment for threats and opportunities to avoid punishment. Some retreated so far into themselves that they became almost ghost-like, moving through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, emotionally disconnected from their own lives as a survival mechanism. Others fought back, and their stories were rarely happy ones. A daughter-in-law who challenged her mother-in-law's authority might find herself beaten, starved, or locked in a storage room for days. One who complained to her husband about mistreatment might be divorced and sent back to her family in disgrace. One who tried to run away might be dragged back and subjected to public humiliation designed to warn other wives about the consequences of rebellion. The most tragic cases were the young wives who simply couldn't adapt to their new lives and chose death over continued suffering. Suicide rates among young married women in ancient China were extraordinarily high, particularly in the first few years after marriage. Some poisoned themselves with household chemicals, others drowned themselves in wells or rivers, and some simply refused to eat until they wasted away. These deaths were rarely investigated or even mourned properly, dismissed as the unfortunate result of weak character or insufficient moral education. But even death wasn't necessarily an escape, because in Chinese spiritual beliefs, suicide was considered a sin that would follow you into the afterlife. Young wives who killed themselves were often buried in unmarked graves, denied proper funeral rites, and believed to be condemned to wander as hungry ghosts for eternity. The system trapped you not just in life, but in death as well, ensuring that even your final act of rebellion would be turned against you. And we haven't even talked about the one thing that could make your life slightly more bearable, or infinitely worse, depending on your luck. Children. Because in ancient China, your value as a wife was measured almost entirely by your ability to produce sons, and if you failed at that most basic function, your already precarious position became completely untenable. The pressure to produce children, specifically male children, began almost immediately after your wedding night. In ancient China, a marriage wasn't considered truly consummated until the wife became pregnant, and it wasn't considered successful until she gave birth to a son. The clock started ticking from day one, and everyone in the household was watching, waiting, and counting the months until you proved your worth as a breeding vessel. If you were lucky enough to conceive quickly, your status in the household might improve slightly. Pregnant women were treated with marginally more care, not out of love or concern for their well-being, but because they were carrying potentially valuable cargo. You might get slightly better food, lighter work duties, and fewer beatings, all in service of protecting the potential heir growing inside you. But this improved treatment came with its own terror, because if something went wrong with the pregnancy, you would be blamed entirely. Miscarriages were considered signs of moral failure, spiritual corruption, or divine punishment. If you lost a pregnancy, especially early in your marriage, the family would assume you had done something wrong. Maybe you had been too lazy, too disobedient, or too spiritually impure. Maybe you had eaten the wrong foods, worked too hard, or failed to pray properly to the ancestors. Whatever the cause, it was definitely your fault, and you would be treated accordingly. But the real nightmare began when you actually gave birth. If your first child was a boy, congratulations. You had temporarily saved yourself from complete disgrace. Your status in the household would improve dramatically, though you were still far from safe. You would be expected to produce more sons, because one male heir wasn't enough to guarantee the family's future. Infant mortality rates were high, childhood diseases were common, and accidents happened. The family needed backup heirs, and you were expected to provide them. If your first child was a girl, however, your life became exponentially worse. Daughters were considered disappointments at best, burdens at worst. They couldn't carry on the family name, couldn't perform ancestor worship rituals, and would eventually be married off to another family, taking their dowries with them. A daughter was essentially an expensive investment with no return, and you, as her mother, had failed in your primary duty. The birth of a daughter often triggered a cascade of abuse that could destroy whatever fragile position you had managed to build in the household. Your mother-in-law would become more critical, your husband more distant, and the entire family more convinced that you were fundamentally flawed. Some families would barely acknowledge female births, treating the event like a minor tragedy rather than a celebration. The baby girl herself might receive minimal care, poor nutrition, and little attention, as the family focused their resources on more promising investments. And here's where the pressure became truly unbearable. If you continued to produce daughters instead of sons, your marriage could be dissolved entirely. One of the traditional grounds for divorce in ancient China was failure to produce male heirs, and this wasn't considered cruelty or injustice. It was considered practical family management. A wife who couldn't fulfill her biological purpose was like a plow that couldn't turn soil or a well that couldn't produce water, useless and worthy of replacement. Even if your husband didn't divorce you outright, he was completely within his rights to take concubines who might be more successful at producing sons. Concubinage wasn't adultery in ancient China. It was sound reproductive strategy. Your husband could bring other women into the household, install them in their own quarters, and attempt to father children with them while you watched helplessly from the sidelines. These concubines weren't necessarily treated better than you were. They had their own precarious positions to maintain and their own fears about failing to produce sons. But their presence in the household was a constant reminder of your inadequacy, a living symbol of your failure to fulfill your most basic purpose as a wife. You were expected to manage these women, supervise their daily activities, and somehow maintain household harmony, while they competed with you for your husband's attention and your family's resources. The psychological torture of this situation was exquisite. You were forced to facilitate your own replacement, to smile and nod, while your husband brought home younger, prettier women who might succeed where you had failed. You had to pretend that this arrangement was perfectly normal, even beneficial, while your heart broke a little more each day. You had to suppress your jealousy, your rage, your grief, and your terror, because expressing any of these emotions would be seen as selfish, petty, and unworthy of a virtuous wife. Some women in this situation turned their anger on the concubines, treating them cruelly as a way of asserting what little power they still possessed. Others withdrew completely, becoming shadows in their own homes, present but not really alive. Still others channeled their energy into obsessive attempts to manage their remaining fertility, consulting folk healers, making offerings to fertility gods, and following increasingly desperate remedies designed to help them conceive sons. But even if you eventually managed to produce a son, your troubles were far from over. Male children in ancient China belonged not to their mothers, but to the family patriarch. Your son would be raised according to his grandfather's wishes, educated by tutors chosen by his father, and trained to view you as a servant rather than a parent. The closer your son grew to his father's family, the more distant he would become from you, until eventually you might find yourself serving the very child you had suffered to bring into the world. And if your son died, which happened frequently in an era of poor medical care and dangerous living conditions, the grief would be compounded by terror. A woman who had lost her only son was in a catastrophically vulnerable position. She had fulfilled her biological purpose temporarily, only to have that purpose stripped away by fate, disease, or accident. The family might blame her for the child's death, accusing her of poor care, spiritual corruption, or simple bad luck. Without a living son to anchor her position in the household, she became dispensable once again. The economic realities of marriage in ancient China were equally brutal and designed to ensure that you could never achieve financial independence or security. When you married, any property, money, or valuables you brought with you as dowry became the property of your husband's family. You had no legal right to own anything, no ability to earn your own money, and no access to financial resources without your husband's explicit permission. This economic dependence was absolute and intentional. A woman who couldn't support herself financially couldn't leave an abusive marriage, couldn't protect herself from exploitation, and couldn't make decisions based on her own interests rather than her family's demands. You were trapped not just by social expectations and legal restrictions, but by simple economic reality. You literally could not afford to be independent. Your labor, meanwhile, was considered part of your marital obligations rather than work deserving of compensation. You might cook, clean, sew, farm, tend animals, care for children, nurse sick relatives, and manage household finances, all without receiving any payment or recognition for your contributions. The economic value of your work was enormous, but it all flowed to your husband's family rather than to you personally. If you had any special skills, talents, or knowledge, these too became family property. If you were skilled at weaving, your textiles would be sold for the family's benefit. If you were talented at cooking, you would prepare food for family businesses or special occasions without compensation. If you had literacy skills rare for women, you might be used to keep family records or conduct correspondence, again without pay or recognition. This economic exploitation extended even to your most intimate relationships. If you managed to maintain friendships with other women, these relationships were monitored and controlled by your in-laws, who worried that outside influences might make you discontent with your situation. If you wanted to visit your birth family, you needed permission and often an escort, because unsupervised contact with your original family might remind you of alternatives to your current life. The only way to achieve any measure of economic security was through your children, particularly your sons. If you successfully raised sons to adulthood, and if those sons achieved financial success, and if they felt grateful enough to support you in your old age, you might eventually enjoy some comfort and respect. But this was a long-term gamble with terrible odds, requiring you to survive decades of abuse, exploitation, and uncertainty, while betting everything on children who might die, move away, or simply choose to abandon you when you were no longer useful. Many women in ancient China never lived to see this potential payoff. The combination of poor nutrition, dangerous working conditions, frequent pregnancies, limited medical care, and constant stress meant that life expectancy for married women was brutally short. You might survive childhood only to die in your 20s from childbirth complications, in your 30s from exhaustion and malnutrition, or in your 40s from diseases that would be easily treatable today. And even if you did survive to old age, there was no guarantee that your sacrifice and suffering would be rewarded with comfort or respect. Old women in ancient China were often viewed as burdens, consuming family resources without contributing productive labor. If your sons were unsuccessful or ungrateful, if your daughters-in-law were cruel, if your grandchildren were disrespectful, your final years might be spent in poverty, neglect, and isolation, forgotten by the very family you had spent your entire life serving. The psychological strategies that women developed to survive these conditions were as varied as they were heartbreaking. Some retreated into fantasy worlds, creating rich inner lives that provided escape from their harsh realities. Others focused obsessively on small pleasures, finding meaning in tiny moments of beauty or kindness that punctuated their days of drudgery. Still others developed a kind of emotional numbness, protecting themselves by feeling as little as possible about their circumstances. Religious and spiritual practices provided another form of survival mechanism. Many women found solace in Buddhist or Taoist teachings that promised eventual escape from suffering, either in this life through enlightenment or in future lives through karma. Others developed deep devotion to folk deities, particularly goddesses associated with mercy, protection, and feminine power. These spiritual practices offered hope, community, and a sense of purpose that transcended their immediate circumstances. But perhaps the most common survival strategy was what we might call strategic compliance, learning to navigate the system so skillfully that they could minimize punishment while maximizing whatever small privileges and protections were available. This meant becoming expert readers of mood and atmosphere, learning to anticipate needs and desires before they were expressed, and developing the ability to appear grateful and content regardless of their actual feelings. The women who survived longest were often those who learned to find allies among other powerless household members, forming secret networks of mutual support and information sharing. They might look out for each other's children, share resources when possible, and provide emotional support during the worst crises. These relationships had to be carefully hidden from the family authorities, who viewed any sign of solidarity among subordinates as a potential threat to their control. Tomorrow night, we'll continue this journey into the suffocating world of ancient Chinese marriage, exploring the religious and cultural forces that justified this system of oppression, the rare stories of resistance and rebellion, and the gradual changes that eventually transformed marriage from ownership to partnership. But for now, Let these realities settle in your mind like stones in still water, heavy with the weight of countless lives lived in quiet desperation, and be grateful that you were born into a world where love, choice, and individual dignity are not just possible, but expected. Sleep well, knowing that your worst relationship problems pale in comparison to the systematic destruction of human spirit that was once considered normal, natural, and necessary. And remember that the freedom to choose your own partner, to leave if you're unhappy, and to be treated as an equal human being, these are precious gifts that millions of people throughout history never experienced. Gifts that should never be taken for granted. The system was so perfectly designed to crush your spirit that even your attempts at resistance would be turned against you. Let's say you somehow found the courage to speak up, to complain about your treatment, or to demand better conditions. Your rebellion would be met not with negotiation or compromise, but with escalation. Your mother-in-law would double down on her cruelty. Your husband would withdraw his protection entirely, and the entire household would unite against you as a troublemaker who threatened family harmony. And here's the truly insidious part. Your resistance would be reframed as moral failure, not as justified anger or reasonable demands, but as evidence that you were selfish, ungrateful, and fundamentally flawed as a woman. The family would whisper that your parents had failed to raise you properly, that your character was weak, and that you lacked the virtue necessary to be a good wife. Your suffering would be presented as self-inflicted, the natural consequence of your own spiritual inadequacies. The few women who managed to maintain any sense of defiance often paid a terrible price. They might be subjected to public humiliation designed to break their will, forced to kneel in courtyards while neighbors watched and judged. They might be denied food for days at a time, locked in storage rooms, or beaten so severely that they couldn't walk properly for weeks. Some were forced to wear signs around their necks announcing their disobedience, marking them as cautionary tales for other wives who might consider stepping out of line. But the most effective punishment was isolation. A rebellious wife might find herself completely cut off from any human warmth or kindness. Family members would stop speaking to her except to give orders. Neighbors would cross the street to avoid her. Even servants would treat her with contempt, sensing that she had fallen from whatever minimal grace she had once possessed. The psychological impact of this complete social rejection was often more devastating than physical abuse. Your only hope of improving your situation lay in mastering an impossible balancing act. You had to be submissive enough to avoid punishment, but not so broken that you couldn't function effectively. You had to be grateful enough to seem properly appreciative, but not so enthusiastic that you appeared to be mocking the family's authority. You had to be invisible enough to avoid unwanted attention, but present enough to anticipate needs before they were expressed. This required developing an almost supernatural awareness of the emotional climate around you. You learned to read facial expressions like weather patterns, detecting the first signs of anger, frustration, or disappointment before they could explode into violence. You became expert at interpreting subtle changes in tone, posture, and routine that might signal shifts in household dynamics. You developed the ability to make yourself useful without seeming presumptuous, helpful without appearing to overstep your bounds. The mental energy required to maintain this constant vigilance was exhausting. You couldn't relax, couldn't let your guard down, couldn't trust that a moment of peace meant safety rather than the calm before a storm. Every interaction was a potential trap, every conversation a minefield of possible offense. You lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, your nervous system constantly activated by the need to scan for threats and opportunities. Sleep became elusive, not just because of your physical exhaustion from daily labor, but because your mind couldn't stop analyzing the day's interactions, searching for signs of trouble ahead. You might lie awake replaying conversations, wondering if you had said something wrong, worried about how you would be received the next morning. Rest was a luxury you couldn't afford when survival depended on constant awareness. Even your dreams weren't safe. Many wives reported nightmares about failing their families, being cast out in disgrace, or watching their children suffer because of their inadequacies. Others dreamed obsessively about their former homes, their parents, their siblings, anyone who might have once loved them unconditionally. These dreams were both comfort and torture, reminders of what they had lost and could never reclaim. The few moments of genuine peace came in unexpected places, perhaps in the pre-dawn darkness when you were alone with your thoughts while preparing the day's first meal. Maybe in the rhythm of repetitive tasks like grinding grain or mending clothes, when your hands could work while your mind wandered to safer places. Sometimes in brief conversations with other household women when the authorities were distracted, stolen moments of human connection that reminded you that you still existed as more than just a function. These tiny respites were precious beyond measure, hoarded like coins against future hardship. A kind word from another servant, a moment of laughter shared with a child, a brief glimpse of beauty in a garden or sunset. These small experiences became the foundation of psychological survival. They proved that joy was still possible, even if it had to be hidden and protected like a fragile flame in a hurricane. But the system was designed to minimize even these small comforts. Your schedule was controlled to prevent idle time that might lead to dangerous thoughts. Your interactions were monitored to prevent the formation of alliances that might threaten family authority. Your access to beauty, literature, music, or art was severely limited because these things might awaken desires that couldn't be satisfied within your prescribed role. Education was particularly feared by the authorities who controlled your life. A wife who could read might encounter ideas that made her dissatisfied with her position. One who could write might communicate with the outside world in ways that couldn't be monitored. One who understood mathematics might realize the true economic value of her labor and begin to question why she received none of it. Knowledge was power, and power in the hands of wives was considered dangerous to the natural order. This deliberate ignorance was enforced through systematic exclusion from intellectual life. Important family discussions happened when you weren't present. Books and documents were kept away from areas where you worked. Conversations about politics, philosophy, or current events stopped when you entered the room. You were treated like a child or a simple-minded servant, assumed to be incapable of understanding complex ideas, even if you clearly possessed intelligence and curiosity. The psychological impact of this intellectual starvation was profound. Your mind, denied stimulation and challenge, might begin to feel sluggish and dull. You might start to believe the family's assessment of your limited capabilities, internalizing their view of you as naturally inferior and intellectually inadequate. This learned helplessness served the system's purposes perfectly, creating women who couldn't imagine alternatives to their current situation because they had been systematically prevented from developing the mental tools necessary to envision change. Yet some women found ways to nurture their minds despite these restrictions. They might memorize poetry overheard from educated family members, creating secret libraries in their heads. They might develop sophisticated understanding of human nature through careful observation of family dynamics. They might become expert botanists through their work in gardens, or skilled mathematicians through household management, or gifted psychologists through their need to navigate complex emotional landscapes. These hidden talents were rarely recognized or valued by their families, but they provided internal sources of pride and identity that couldn't be completely destroyed by external oppression. A woman might know herself to be intelligent, creative, and capable, even if the world insisted she was none of these things. This secret knowledge became a form of resistance, a private rebellion that helped preserve some essential core of selfhood. The seasonal rhythms of life provided another framework for survival. Spring brought hope for better harvests and easier times ahead. Summer offered longer days and warmer weather that made physical labor slightly less brutal. Autumn brought festivals and celebrations that interrupted the monotony of daily drudgery. Winter, harsh as it was, often meant slower work schedules and more time spent indoors with other women. Opportunities for conversation and connection that were rare during busier seasons. Religious festivals were particularly important as they provided legitimate reasons to break from routine, visit other households, and participate in community activities. During these celebrations, the normal hierarchy might be temporarily relaxed, allowing for brief experiences of joy, beauty, and social connection. Women might share special foods, wear their best clothes, or participate in ceremonies that reminded them of their spiritual worth, even if their social value was constantly questioned. But even these celebrations carried their own stresses and dangers. Festivals required extra work to prepare special foods and decorations. They brought increased scrutiny as families tried to present their best face to the community. They created opportunities for comparison with other households that might result in criticism or punishment if your family's display was judged inadequate. Joy itself became another performance that had to be managed carefully. The changing seasons also marked the passage of time in ways that could be either hopeful or terrifying. Each year that passed without producing a son brought you closer to being declared infertile and replaceable. Each festival season reminded you of your advancing age and diminishing value in a system that prized youth and potential above experience and wisdom. Each harvest cycle was a reminder of your own mortality and the limited time you had to establish some security for your future. Weather patterns became deeply meaningful in ways that might seem superstitious to modern minds, but made perfect sense in a world where your survival depended on forces beyond your control. A good harvest meant better food and fewer beatings. A harsh winter meant increased tensions and competition for limited resources. A drought meant economic stress that would inevitably be taken out on the most vulnerable family members. You learned to read the sky like a prophet, understanding that meteorology was psychology, that atmospheric pressure translated directly into household pressure. The physical environment of your new home became charged with emotional significance. Certain rooms might be associated with punishment or humiliation. Particular corners might offer brief privacy or safety. The kitchen could be a place of backbreaking labor or rare moments of creativity and accomplishment. The courtyard might be a stage for public shame or a space for quiet reflection in stolen moments. Your relationship with objects also took on deeper meaning than you might expect. The clothes you wore, often hand-me-downs from your mother-in-law or sisters-in-law, carried the history of other women's lives and struggles. The tools you used for cooking and cleaning became extensions of your body, familiar weights and textures that provided comfort through their constancy. The bedding you shared with your husband might be the only space that felt even remotely private. though privacy itself was largely an illusion in households where walls were thin and secrets were dangerous. Food became a complex language of power, control, and survival. What you ate, when you ate, and how much you ate were all determined by your position in the family hierarchy. The best portions went to the patriarch, then to his sons, then to other male relatives, then to senior women, and finally, whatever remained might be given to junior wives and female children. Hunger was a constant companion, not because there wasn't enough food, but because there wasn't enough food for you. Cooking itself became a form of psychological warfare. You were expected to prepare elaborate meals for others while surviving on scraps yourself. You had to smile while serving delicacies to people who treated you like dirt. You had to pretend gratitude for the opportunity to work yourself into exhaustion while others enjoyed the fruits of your labor. The kitchen became a stage where the family's power dynamics were performed daily through rituals of service and submission. But food could also be one of the few areas where you might exercise tiny amounts of creativity and control. A perfectly prepared meal might earn you brief approval or protection from criticism. Secret seasonings or cooking techniques passed down from your mother might provide small connections to your lost identity. Sharing food with other powerless household members could create bonds of mutual support that helped everyone survive. The sounds of the household became a complex symphony that you learned to interpret with deadly accuracy. Footsteps in the corridor might announce approaching danger or opportunity. Voices from other rooms carried information about mood, plans, and potential threats. The absence of normal sounds could be just as significant as their presence, indicating changes in routine that might affect your safety or duties. You developed almost superhuman hearing, able to detect emotional undertones in conversations happening rooms away. You learned to distinguish between different types of anger, identifying which ones might blow over quickly and which ones might result in lasting punishment for whoever happened to be nearby. You could hear opportunity in the sound of visitors arriving, danger in the particular way your mother-in-law's voice changed when she was planning discipline, hope in the laughter of children who might be convinced to advocate for you. Silence became both refuge and trap. Quiet moments might offer brief respite from constant vigilance, but they could also indicate that you were being watched, evaluated, or discussed by family members who were deciding your fate. You learned to be comfortable with your own company during long hours of solitary labor, but you also learned to fear the kind of silence that preceded storms. The rhythm of your days was dictated entirely by others' needs and desires, but within that rigid structure, you might find tiny spaces for personal agency. The order in which you completed tasks, the specific techniques you used for familiar chores, the thoughts you allowed yourself to think while your hands were busy. These microscopic choices became precious assertions of individual will in a life otherwise controlled by others. Even your physical movements were constrained and monitored. How you walked, where you looked, how you held your hands, all of these were subject to criticism and correction. Bound feet meant that walking was always painful and precarious, turning every step into a reminder of your limitation and vulnerability. Your posture had to convey appropriate submission without appearing weak or sickly. Your facial expressions had to show proper respect without seeming false or mocking. The constant physical discomfort became another layer of psychological pressure. Chronic pain from bound feet, malnutrition, and overwork created a persistent background of suffering that made clear thinking and emotional regulation even more difficult. You had to perform complex social and emotional labor while dealing with bodies that hurt constantly, minds that were often foggy from hunger and exhaustion, and spirits that were systematically crushed by daily humiliation. Sleep itself became another battleground in your war for survival. The luxury of uninterrupted rest was reserved for the family's most valuable members, which definitely didn't include you. Your sleep was fragmented by the needs of others, broken by crying children, sick relatives, or simply the anxiety that kept your mind racing through potential disasters that tomorrow might bring. You might be awakened in the middle of the night to tend to a feverish child, prepare medicine for an elderly family member, or simply because your mother-in-law had decided that the floor needed scrubbing before dawn. Sleep deprivation became a tool of control, ensuring that you were never mentally sharp enough to plan escape or rebellion, never physically strong enough to resist demands, never emotionally stable enough to maintain hope for something better. The bed you shared with your husband wasn't a place of intimacy or comfort, but another location where your powerlessness was reinforced nightly. You had no say in when or how sexual relations occurred. You couldn't refuse, couldn't negotiate, couldn't even express preferences without risking punishment. Your body belonged to him as completely as any other household possession, available for his use whenever he desired. Pregnancy brought its own special horrors beyond the obvious physical dangers. Each time you conceived, the entire household would monitor your every action, breath, and expression for signs that might predict the child's gender. Old women would examine the way you carried the baby, the foods you craved, the changes in your complexion, all searching for omens that might indicate whether you were finally fulfilling your purpose or disappointing everyone once again. The superstitions surrounding pregnancy were endless and contradictory, creating impossible standards that guaranteed you would always be doing something wrong. You shouldn't lift heavy objects, but you also couldn't shirk your regular duties. You should eat certain foods for the baby's health, but you couldn't demand special meals that might seem presumptuous. You needed rest for proper development, but you also had to maintain your productivity to justify the extra resources you consumed. Miscarriages weren't just medical tragedies. They were social catastrophes that could destroy whatever fragile position you had managed to build in the household. The grief you felt for your lost child had to be hidden behind apologies for your failure, promises to do better next time, and gratitude that the family was willing to give you another chance to prove your worth. You weren't allowed to mourn properly because your loss was viewed as a personal failing rather than a shared tragedy. Even successful pregnancies carried the terror of gender disappointment. As your delivery date approached, the household's anxiety would become palpable. Everyone knew that the moment of birth would determine your fate for years to come. You would lie in labor knowing that the child's gender mattered more than its health, that producing a daughter might mean facing years of increased abuse and possible replacement. The birth itself was attended by women whose primary concern wasn't your well-being, but the baby's gender and your family's reputation. If you cried out too much during labor, you might be criticized for weakness or attention-seeking. If you didn't suffer enough, some might whisper that you weren't truly invested in producing a healthy child. Even the most natural human responses to pain and fear were scrutinized and judged. Childbirth mortality rates were staggering, and you knew that each pregnancy might be your last. But even this knowledge couldn't protect you from the pressure to keep trying until you produced enough sons to satisfy your family's needs. Women who survived multiple births often did so with permanent physical damage, chronic pain, and health problems that would plague them for the rest of their shortened lives. The children you did manage to produce and keep alive became both your greatest joy and your most vulnerable point. Your love for them was used against you constantly. If you wanted better treatment, you could be reminded that your children's welfare depended on your compliance. If you considered rebellion, you could be threatened with punishments that would affect your children rather than yourself. Your relationship with your own children was carefully controlled and monitored. You weren't allowed to be their primary authority figure, their main source of affection, or their primary educator. These roles belonged to your husband and his family. You were more like a wet nurse or caretaker, responsible for their physical needs, but not their emotional or intellectual development. Watching your sons grow up to view you as a servant rather than a mother was perhaps one of the cruelest aspects of the entire system. The boys you had carried, birthed, and nursed would be taught to treat you with the same casual disrespect their father showed. They would learn that your opinions didn't matter, your feelings weren't important, and your primary value lay in your ability to serve their needs without complaint. Your daughters faced an even grimmer future, and knowing what awaited them added another layer of heartbreak to your daily existence. You would watch these bright, curious little girls gradually have their spirits crushed by the same system that had destroyed yours. You might try to prepare them, to teach them survival strategies, but you also knew that too much preparation might be seen as rebellion. Too much sympathy might be viewed as encouraging disobedience. The economic reality of child rearing in ancient China was particularly cruel for mothers. You provided all the labor, sacrifice, and love required to raise children, but you received none of the long-term benefits of that investment. Sons belonged to their father's family line. Daughters would be married off to serve other families. The children you sacrificed everything to nurture would ultimately belong to everyone except you. Healthcare, such as it was, reflected the same hierarchies that governed every other aspect of life. When family members became ill, resources were allocated according to their perceived value. The patriarch received the best available care, expensive medicines, and the attention of skilled healers. Sons got decent treatment because they represented the family's future. You and other junior women might receive minimal care or be expected to treat yourselves with home remedies and folk cures. The irony was that women often knew more about practical medicine than anyone else in the household. You were the one who tended sick children, prepared herbal remedies, and dealt with the daily reality of keeping people healthy. But this knowledge wasn't valued or recognized as expertise. It was just considered part of your natural duties as a woman, like cooking or cleaning. When you became seriously ill, the family's response would depend entirely on your current usefulness and their financial situation. A young wife who was still capable of producing children might receive some investment in her recovery. An older woman who had outlived her reproductive value might be left to recover or die on her own. The calculation was always economic, never emotional or moral. Mental health was a concept that didn't exist in any recognizable form, but the psychological toll of your life was undeniable. Depression, anxiety, and what we might now recognize as complex trauma were so common among wives that they were considered normal aspects of feminine nature. Women were expected to be melancholy, fearful, and emotionally unstable because these were seen as natural consequences of their inferior spiritual and intellectual development. The few women who maintained their mental sharpness and emotional strength despite years of abuse, were often viewed with suspicion. A wife who seemed too resilient, too intelligent, or too independent might be accused of witchcraft, demonic possession, or simply bad character. Your survival strategies had to be subtle enough to work without drawing attention to your capabilities. Suicide, as we mentioned earlier, was tragically common, but it was also complicated by spiritual beliefs about the afterlife. Many women who contemplated ending their suffering were deterred by fears about what would happen to their souls, their children's welfare, or their family's reputation. Even death wasn't a simple escape because it carried its own risks and consequences. The women who survived longest often did so by developing elaborate internal worlds that provided refuge from external reality. They might create detailed fantasies about other lives they could have lived, other families they might have joined, other versions of themselves that were valued and loved. These mental escapes weren't signs of mental illness, but adaptive responses to impossible circumstances. Some found solace in religious practices that emphasized eventual liberation from suffering. Buddhism's promise that all life contained suffering, but that suffering could be transcended, offered hope for future incarnations, if not present relief. Taoism's emphasis on accepting what couldn't be changed while working within natural rhythms provided a framework for finding peace within chaos. Folk religions often provided more immediate comfort through goddesses and spirits who understood women's particular struggles. Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy, was particularly beloved by suffering wives who prayed for her intervention in their daily lives. Local spirits might be petitioned for small favors, protection from abuse, or simply the strength to endure another day. The seasonal festivals we mentioned earlier often had special significance for women because they provided rare opportunities for community connection and spiritual renewal. During these celebrations, you might briefly reconnect with other women who understood your struggles, share stories and strategies for survival, or simply remember that you were part of something larger than your immediate family's cruelty. But even these moments of relief carried their own dangers. Too much joy during festivals might be seen as inappropriate for someone in your position. Too much connection with other women might be viewed as plotting or conspiracy. Too much spiritual enthusiasm might be interpreted as neglecting your earthly duties. Every pleasure had to be measured, controlled, and justified. The clothing you wore told the story of your status more clearly than words ever could. Your garments were chosen to emphasize your subordinate position, your lack of individual identity, and your role as family property. Colors, fabrics, and styles were all regulated according to strict hierarchies that made your place in the social order visible to everyone who saw you. New wives often wore clothing that had been passed down from older female family members, garments that carried the history of other women's struggles and submissions. These clothes rarely fit properly, were often worn and patched, and served as daily reminders that you owned nothing, not even the cloth that covered your body. Your appearance was managed by others according to their preferences and the family's financial situation. The jewelry you wore, if any, was similarly controlled. Valuable pieces belonged to the family and could be taken away at any time. Simple ornaments might be allowed as long as they didn't suggest pretensions above your station. Even these small adornments carried messages about your position, your behavior, and your family's assessment of your current value. Your hair was perhaps the most regulated aspect of your appearance. How you wore it, what ornaments were allowed, when you could wash it, all of these decisions were made for you according to complex rules about age, marital status, and family position. Hair was considered a crucial marker of feminine virtue and social standing, so every strand was subject to scrutiny and control. The daily routine of grooming became another opportunity for others to assert their authority over your body and appearance. You might be criticized for vanity if you spent too much time on your appearance, but also criticized for slovenliness if you didn't maintain proper standards. Finding the correct balance required constant attention to others' expectations and reactions. Personal hygiene was limited by access to water, soap, and privacy, all of which were controlled by family authorities. You might be allowed to bathe occasionally, but the timing, duration, and location of these activities were determined by others according to their schedules and priorities. Your body's needs were always secondary to the family's convenience. The few personal possessions you might be allowed to keep were usually items that had no economic value but carried emotional significance. A hair ornament from your mother, a piece of cloth from your wedding dress, a small religious charm. These tiny treasures became anchors to your identity and sources of comfort during the darkest moments. But even these meager possessions were precarious. They could be confiscated as punishment, destroyed during fits of anger, or simply lost during the frequent moves and changes that characterized household life. Nothing was truly yours. Nothing was safe from others' whims, and nothing could be counted on to provide permanent comfort or security. The progression of seasons brought different challenges and opportunities for survival. Spring meant increased agricultural work, but also the hope that came with new growth and warmer weather. Summer brought longer days of labor, but also more opportunities for small pleasures like fresh fruit or time spent outdoors. Autumn meant harvest pressures, but also festivals and the satisfaction of completed work. Winter was often the most dangerous season, not just because of cold and hunger, but because families were trapped together in close quarters for months at a time. Tensions that might be manageable during busier seasons could explode into violence when people were confined together with limited resources and no escape. You learned to dread the approach of winter almost as much as you looked forward to its end. The natural world outside your household became a source of both comfort and longing. You might glimpse birds flying freely overhead and envy their ability to go wherever they wished. You might see wild flowers growing untended and remember what it felt like to exist without constant supervision. You might watch the moon through your window and wonder if somewhere else, other women were looking at the same moon while living completely different lives. These moments of connection with nature were precious but also painful, because they reminded you of everything you had lost and could never reclaim. The beauty of the natural world continued regardless of human suffering, indifferent to your struggles and dreams. This could be either comforting or devastating, depending on your state of mind and current circumstances. The sounds of nature, birds singing, wind in trees, rain on roofs, became a soundtrack for your internal life that provided relief from the constant human voices telling you what to do, how to behave, and what to think. These natural sounds belonged to no one, required no permission to enjoy, and connected you to something larger than the tiny world of household politics and family hierarchy. But even these simple pleasures had to be stolen in moments when no one was watching, enjoyed secretly, like forbidden fruit. Too much time spent gazing out windows or listening to birdsong might be interpreted as laziness, daydreaming, or dissatisfaction with your proper duties. Every joy had to be hidden, every moment of peace disguised as productivity. The future stretched ahead like an endless corridor of similar days, each one bringing the same challenges, the same fears, the same small hopes for tiny improvements in your circumstances. You couldn't plan for dramatic changes because they were impossible within the system that controlled your life. You could only hope for small mercies, brief respites, and the strength to endure whatever came next. This was your reality in ancient China, a life carefully designed to ensure that you never felt secure, never felt valued, and never felt free. A system so perfectly calibrated to crush human spirit that even your dreams of escape were turned into sources of additional suffering. And yet somehow, some women not only survived this system, but found ways to maintain their humanity, their dignity, and their hope for something better. Their stories, largely unrecorded and forgotten by official history, represent some of the most remarkable examples of human resilience and courage in the face of systematic oppression. These women learned to find meaning in meaningless lives, beauty in ugly circumstances, and love in loveless marriages. They developed survival strategies so sophisticated that they could maintain their sanity while appearing to accept their fate completely. But the cost of this survival was enormous, paid in lost dreams, suppressed talents, and lives lived in constant fear and uncertainty. The women who endured ancient Chinese marriage weren't just victims of a cruel system. They were warriors fighting a daily battle for their souls, their sanity, and their right to exist as human beings rather than property. And tomorrow night, we'll explore how this system finally began to crack under the weight of its own contradictions, how external pressures and internal resistance gradually created spaces for change, and how the women who survived these impossible circumstances laid the groundwork for future generations who would eventually claim the freedom, dignity, and choice that had been denied to their mothers and grandmothers for thousands of years. The few forms of rebellion available to you were so dangerous they often proved worse than submission. But desperation sometimes bred courage, and scattered throughout the centuries were women who found ways to resist, even knowing the consequences would be swift and brutal. Some women turned to poison, not to kill others, but to slowly damage their own fertility. They would consume herbs known to prevent conception or cause miscarriages, preferring the pain of lost pregnancies to the certainty of producing children who would become tools for their continued oppression. These women understood that motherhood, supposedly their highest calling, was actually their greatest vulnerability. Every child you bore gave your in-laws more leverage over you, more ways to ensure your compliance through threats to your offspring. Others practiced more subtle forms of resistance. They might consistently undercook rice for family members they despised, season food with excessive salt when preparing meals for cruel relatives, or deliberately shrink expensive garments while washing them. These tiny acts of sabotage provided psychological relief while remaining virtually undetectable. The risk was enormous, but so was the need to assert some measure of agency in a life otherwise completely controlled by others. The most daring rebels attempted escape, though the odds against success were staggering. A woman with bound feet couldn't travel far on foot. A woman without money couldn't purchase transportation or food. A woman without male protection was vulnerable to bandits, slave traders, and officials who might return her to her family for a reward. Even if you somehow managed to flee your village, where could you go? Your birth family had already sold you and wouldn't take you back. Other families wouldn't harbor a runaway wife, fearing retribution from your in-laws. Yet some tried anyway. They would slip away in the darkest hours before dawn, hobbling on their damaged feet toward destinations they couldn't clearly envision. Some headed for Buddhist convents, hoping to find sanctuary in religious life. Others aimed for distant cities where they might disappear into the anonymous masses of beggars and street vendors. A precious few had managed to save tiny amounts of money or jewelry that might purchase temporary safety. The punishments for attempted escape were designed to deter other women from similar acts. Runaways who were caught might be branded with hot irons, have their heads shaved publicly, or be forced to wear wooden collars that announced their shame to everyone they encountered. Some were sold to brothels as punishment, transforming their rebellion into a fate worse than their original circumstances. Others were beaten so severely they never walked properly again, their damaged bodies serving as permanent warnings to other wives who might consider flight. But perhaps the cruelest punishment was the fate of any children left behind. Your in-laws might take out their fury on your sons and daughters, treating them as outcasts within their own family. Children of runaway mothers were marked by shame that could follow them throughout their lives, affecting their own marriage prospects and social standing. This knowledge kept many women trapped, even when opportunities for escape presented themselves. The women who survived these harsh realities often did so by forming secret networks of mutual support that operated beneath the surface of household life. These alliances had to be invisible to family authorities, communicated through glances, gestures, and coded conversations that could be dismissed as harmless chatter if overheard by the wrong people. A senior servant might warn you about your mother-in-law's particularly foul mood before you encountered her. A sister-in-law might share food when you were being punished with hunger. An elderly aunt might offer herbal remedies for injuries you couldn't explain without admitting to abuse. These small acts of kindness were lifelines thrown across the ocean of daily cruelty, reminders that you weren't completely alone, even in your darkest moments. The bonds formed between women in these circumstances were often deeper than blood relationships, forged in shared suffering and maintained through mutual risk. You might develop a wordless communication system with another oppressed household member, able to convey warnings, comfort, or practical information through subtle changes in expression or posture. These connections had to be carefully hidden because family authorities viewed any sign of solidarity among subordinates as a potential threat to their control. Some women found ways to pass down survival knowledge through generations, teaching daughters and daughters-in-law the techniques that had kept them alive. This wisdom was transmitted through stories that seemed like harmless folklore, but actually contained practical advice about reading family moods, avoiding punishment, and finding moments of peace within chaos. Traditional songs might carry coded messages about which herbs could prevent pregnancy or ease the pain of beatings. The art of strategic invisibility became a highly developed skill among women who learned to survive by never drawing attention to themselves. You discovered how to move through the household like a ghost, completing your duties efficiently while remaining unnoticed by family members who might otherwise find reasons to criticize or punish you. You learned to anticipate needs before they were expressed, preventing the anger that came with having to ask for services that should have been provided automatically. This invisibility required perfect knowledge of household routines, family preferences, and the subtle signs that indicated changing moods or expectations. You became an expert in human psychology out of necessity, developing an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional climate around you and adjust your behavior accordingly. Your survival depended on this hypervigilance, this constant scanning for threats and opportunities. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life provided some structure and predictability to existence that might otherwise feel completely chaotic. During planting season, everyone was focused on the fields, which might mean longer hours of work, but also less time for family members to focus their attention on finding fault with your behavior. Harvest time brought exhaustion, but also the satisfaction of completed tasks and perhaps slightly better food as fresh crops became available. Wedding seasons in the village meant opportunities to observe other young women being absorbed into the same system you had endured, watching their terror and innocence with a mixture of sympathy and bitter recognition. You might catch the eye of a new bride and try to convey some wordless encouragement, knowing that any more direct intervention could be dangerous for both of you. These moments connected you to the larger community of women sharing similar fates. Funeral seasons brought different challenges and opportunities. Death in the household might temporarily disrupt normal hierarchies as everyone focused on mourning rituals and practical arrangements. The grief process could create brief spaces for human connection and emotional expression that were normally forbidden. You might be allowed to cry openly for the first time in months, using the socially acceptable occasion of death to release tears that had been building up from your own daily suffering. Religious festivals continued to provide the most legitimate opportunities for community interaction and temporary escape from household surveillance. During major celebrations, you might be allowed to visit temples, participate in processions, or attend gatherings where women from different families could meet and share experiences. These events had to be navigated carefully because they were also opportunities for your in-laws to display your obedience and their family's prosperity to the broader community. The temple visits during festivals were particularly precious because they offered access to female religious figures who might provide spiritual guidance or simply serve as examples of women who had found alternative paths through life. Buddhist nuns represented a different model of female existence, one based on spiritual development rather than service to male family members. While becoming a nun wasn't a realistic option for most married women, their presence proved that other ways of living were possible. Folk religious practices often centered on goddesses who understood women's particular struggles and could be petitioned for protection, healing, or strength to endure suffering. Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy, was particularly beloved by wives who prayed for her intervention in their daily lives. These prayers had to be offered secretly because too much religious devotion might be interpreted as neglecting earthly duties or seeking supernatural solutions to problems that should be solved through greater obedience. The changing seasons also marked the passage of time in ways that could be either hopeful or terrifying, depending on your circumstances. Each year that passed without producing a son brought you closer to being declared infertile and possibly replaced. Each harvest cycle was a reminder of your advancing age and diminishing value in a system that prized youth and potential above experience and wisdom. Each winter survived was a small victory, but also a step closer to old age when your usefulness would decline even further. The economic realities of your position became clearer with each passing year. The dowry you had brought to the marriage was quickly absorbed into family finances, becoming indistinguishable from other household resources. Any skills you possessed were exploited without compensation, your labor contributing to family prosperity, while you remained personally impoverished. The gap between the value you created and the benefits you received grew wider as your productivity increased, but your status remained fixed at the bottom of the family hierarchy. Your relationship with money became complex and fraught with danger. You were expected to manage household expenses efficiently while having no legal right to the funds you administered. You might know exactly how much the family spent on food, clothing, and other necessities. But you couldn't spend a single coin on your own needs without explicit permission. This economic powerlessness reinforced your dependence and made planning for any kind of future independence virtually impossible. The few opportunities to earn small amounts of money had to be pursued carefully because too much economic independence might threaten family control. You might be allowed to sell eggs from chickens you tended or vegetables from gardens you maintained, but the proceeds would typically be turned over to family authorities. Keeping even tiny amounts for yourself required elaborate deception and carried serious risks if discovered. Some women found ways to create hidden reserves by saving minuscule amounts over long periods, perhaps by claiming that eggs had been lost to predators or that vegetables had spoiled before they could be sold. These tiny funds might eventually purchase small comforts or emergency supplies, but they could never accumulate enough to provide real financial security or escape options. The psychological impact of this economic exploitation was profound. You could see the direct results of your labor in family prosperity while experiencing constant financial anxiety about your own basic needs. You might work harder than anyone else in the household while being the last to receive food, clothing, or medical care. This disconnect between contribution and reward created a sense of injustice that had to be carefully hidden behind expressions of gratitude and contentment. Your living space within the household reflected your status with painful clarity. You might share a small room with your husband and any children, crowded into quarters that provided no privacy or personal space. Your belongings, if you had any, might be stored in a single small box or bundle that could be easily moved if you fell from family favor. The lack of permanent private space reinforced your temporary status and prevented you from creating any sense of home or sanctuary. The bed you shared with your husband wasn't a place of intimacy or rest, but another location where your powerlessness was demonstrated nightly. You had no control over when or how sexual relations occurred, no ability to refuse or negotiate, no right to express preferences or desires. Your body was available for his use according to his wishes and family expectations about producing heirs, regardless of your physical or emotional state. Sleep became a luxury that had to be stolen in fragments between duties and disruptions. Your rest was frequently interrupted by crying children, sick relatives, or simply family members who needed services at inconvenient hours. The chronic sleep deprivation affected your physical health, mental clarity, and emotional stability, making it even more difficult to cope with daily challenges and maintain hope for improvement. Dreams provided both escape and torment, offering visions of different lives while highlighting the impossibility of change. You might dream of your childhood home, your parents, your siblings, anyone who had once loved you unconditionally. These dreams were simultaneously comforting and heartbreaking, reminders of what you had lost and could never reclaim. Sometimes you dreamed of the future, imagining scenarios where your children grew up to protect and cherish you. But these fantasies often felt more like cruel jokes than realistic possibilities. The progression through different life stages brought new challenges and occasional small improvements in status. As a young wife, you were at the bottom of every hierarchy, valuable primarily for your potential to produce children, but otherwise considered inexperienced and potentially unreliable. If you successfully produced sons and survived the dangerous early years of marriage, Your position might improve slightly as you gained seniority and proved your worth to the family. Middle age brought different challenges as your reproductive years ended and your value shifted from potential to proven service. If you had successfully raised sons who respected you, if you had demonstrated loyalty and competence over many years, if you had survived the diseases and accidents that claimed many women, you might finally achieve some measure of security and respect within the household. But this improved status came at an enormous cost, paid in decades of submission, sacrifice, and silent suffering. The woman who finally achieved a small measure of power and respect was often a shadow of the girl who had entered the marriage, her spirit shaped by years of systematic oppression into something that could survive but might never truly flourish. Old age brought its own particular vulnerabilities. As your physical strength declined and your usefulness to the family decreased. If your sons were successful and grateful, if your daughters-in-law were kind, if your health remained reasonably good, your final years might be spent in relative comfort. But if any of these conditions failed, old age could become a time of neglect, poverty, and abandonment by the very family you had spent your life serving. The knowledge that your security in old age depended entirely on factors beyond your control created constant anxiety throughout your adult life. You had to maintain relationships with children who were taught to view you as subordinate, earn the loyalty of daughters-in-law who saw you as competition, and hope that your husband's family would honor their obligations to support you when you could no longer work. The few women who lived long enough to become family matriarchs often perpetuated the same system that had oppressed them, treating their daughters-in-law with the same cruelty they had once endured. This cycle of abuse was one of the system's most insidious features, turning victims into victimizers and ensuring that each generation of women would inflict familiar suffering on the next. But some older women found ways to use their limited power more benevolently, protecting younger women when possible and passing down survival wisdom that might ease their struggles. These women understood that their own suffering could serve a purpose if it helped others navigate similar challenges, transforming their pain into a form of resistance against the system that had caused it. The rare women who managed to maintain their compassion and humanity despite decades of systematic dehumanization represented the ultimate triumph of the human spirit over institutional cruelty. They proved that even the most carefully designed systems of oppression couldn't completely destroy the capacity for love, kindness, and hope that resided in the human heart. These women became quiet heroes, whose names were never recorded in official histories, but whose influence rippled through generations of families they touched. They showed that survival wasn't just about enduring abuse, but about maintaining enough humanity to help others endure as well. Their legacy lived on in the small acts of kindness they performed, the wisdom they shared, and the example they provided of how to remain human in inhuman circumstances. The gradual changes that would eventually transform the marriage system began not with grand political movements or legal reforms, but with these quiet acts of resistance and compassion performed by individual women who refused to let the system completely destroy their spirits. Each woman who helped another, each mother who taught her daughter survival strategies, each wife who maintained her dignity despite systematic humiliation, contributed to a slow accumulation of knowledge and strength that would eventually create the possibility for larger changes. The most heartbreaking aspect of this entire system wasn't just the individual suffering it caused, but how it perpetuated itself through generations like a curse that could never be broken. The girl who was crushed by her mother-in-law's cruelty would grow up to become a mother-in-law herself, and faced with the choice between compassion and survival, Most chose survival. They passed down the same brutality they had endured, not because they were evil, but because the system gave them no other path to security. This cycle created a peculiar form of Stockholm Syndrome on a societal level. Women who had been tortured by the marriage system became its most fervent defenders, arguing that suffering built character, that hardship created virtue, that the pain they had endured was necessary preparation for life's challenges. They convinced themselves that their abuse had meaning, that their sacrifice had purpose, that their degradation was actually a form of spiritual elevation. The few women who tried to break this cycle, who attempted to treat their daughters-in-law with kindness or their own daughters with respect, were often punished by their families and communities. A mother-in-law who was too gentle might be accused of weakness, of failing to properly discipline the younger women under her authority. A mother who encouraged her daughter's independence might be blamed for raising a child who was unmarriageable, rebellious, or contaminated by dangerous ideas about female worth. This social pressure to perpetuate abuse was incredibly powerful because it came not just from men seeking to maintain their dominance, but from other women who had internalized their own oppression so completely that they couldn't imagine alternatives. The system created its own enforcers, its own prison guards, its own torturers, all drawn from the ranks of its victims. The economic machinery that supported this system was equally self-perpetuating. Families that invested in daughters' education or allowed women financial independence were seen as wasteful, impractical, or dangerously progressive. The bride price system meant that daughters were literally profitable to their birth families, creating financial incentives to sell girls as young as possible to the highest bidders. The dowry system meant that families with sons could accumulate wealth through strategic marriages, while families with daughters faced financial ruin. These economic incentives aligned perfectly with social prejudices to create a system where treating women as property wasn't just culturally acceptable, it was economically rational. Families that bucked the trend by treating women as human beings found themselves at a competitive disadvantage, struggling to arrange marriages, maintain social standing, or accumulate the resources necessary for survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. The legal framework supported every aspect of this oppression through codes and customs that made women's subordination not just traditional, but mandatory. Wives who disobeyed their husbands could be legally beaten, divorced, or even killed without consequence. Women who attempted to own property, conduct business, or make independent decisions could be punished by both family and state authorities. The law didn't just permit the abuse of women, it required it as a matter of social order. Even the language reflected and reinforced these power dynamics. The words used to describe wives emphasized their roles as servants, property, or breeding animals rather than human beings. Marriage ceremonies included ritualized language of ownership, transfer, and submission that made the power relationships explicit and public. Children learned from their earliest years that women existed to serve, that female opinions didn't matter, that masculine authority was natural and divine. Religious and philosophical systems provided spiritual justification for what might otherwise be recognized as simple cruelty. Confucian ideals of filial piety and social harmony were twisted to justify the systematic destruction of female autonomy. Buddhist concepts of karma and rebirth were used to suggest that women's suffering was the result of sins committed in previous lives, making their abuse seem like cosmic justice rather than human choice. These spiritual justifications were particularly insidious because they transformed earthly oppression into divine mandate. Women weren't just being abused by their families, they were being punished by the universe itself for moral failures they couldn't remember committing. This made resistance seem not just futile, but actually sinful. Another crime that would result in even worse treatment in future incarnations. The medical understanding of women's bodies and minds reinforced every other aspect of the system through theories that portrayed females as naturally inferior, emotionally unstable, and physically weak. Women's pain was dismissed as natural consequence of their inferior constitution. Their intelligence was explained away as temporary aberration or dangerous abnormality. Their desire for freedom was diagnosed as mental illness, requiring treatment through increased restriction and control. These medical theories weren't based on scientific observation, but on social prejudice disguised as objective knowledge. They provided seemingly rational justification for treating women as less than fully human, as creatures whose needs, desires, and capabilities were fundamentally different from and inferior to men's. The few women who demonstrated intelligence, creativity, or independence were dismissed as exceptions that proved the rule rather than evidence that the rule itself was wrong. The artistic and literary traditions of ancient China reflected these attitudes in works that portrayed ideal women as silent, suffering, and completely selfless. The most celebrated female characters in classical literature were those who endured incredible hardship without complaint, who sacrificed everything for male relatives without question, who chose death over dishonor when their purity was threatened. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were instruction manuals teaching girls how to be properly feminine. The rare works that portrayed women as complex, intelligent, or capable of independent action were typically dismissed as fantasy, comedy, or dangerous propaganda that might give real women inappropriate ideas about their potential. The cultural imagination could conceive of female dragons, goddesses, and magical beings, but struggled to envision ordinary women as fully realized human beings deserving of respect, autonomy, and happiness. Educational systems reinforce these limitations by providing different curricula for boys and girls that prepared them for completely different roles in society. Boys learned reading, writing, mathematics, philosophy, and statecraft, skills that would enable them to participate fully in public life. Girls learned cooking, sewing, household management, and the art of pleasing men, skills designed to make them useful servants rather than independent actors. Even within these limited educational opportunities, girls were taught that their learning was temporary and conditional, something to be abandoned as soon as they married and took on their true roles as wives and mothers. The message was clear. Female intelligence was acceptable only as long as it served male interests, dangerous when it encouraged women to think independently about their circumstances and possibilities. The transportation systems of ancient China made escape virtually impossible for women with bound feet who couldn't walk long distances, couldn't ride horses effectively, and couldn't travel alone without attracting dangerous attention. The few women who attempted to flee their circumstances found themselves trapped by geography as much as by social convention, unable to reach destinations where they might start new lives under different names and circumstances. Communication systems were similarly restrictive, making it nearly impossible for women to maintain relationships with their birth families, coordinate with other oppressed women, or access information about alternatives to their current situations. Letters were often read by family authorities before delivery. Visitors were monitored and controlled. Even conversations between women were subject to surveillance and interpretation by suspicious relatives who feared that too much female solidarity might threaten established hierarchies. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life created temporary fluctuations in women's workloads and treatment, but never provided lasting relief from systematic oppression. During planting and harvest seasons, women might work even longer hours, but face less scrutiny as everyone focused on essential tasks. During winter months, families trapped together in small spaces might become more violent and unpredictable as tensions mounted and resources dwindled. Weather patterns affected women's lives in ways that went far beyond simple comfort or convenience. Droughts meant less food and more competition for limited resources, usually resolved by giving women smaller portions while maintaining men's nutrition. Floods meant displacement, disruption, and often increased vulnerability to violence and exploitation as normal social structures collapsed temporarily. Even good weather could be dangerous if it encouraged travel, trade, or other activities that might expose women to new forms of abuse or exploitation. The technological limitations of ancient China meant that almost all domestic work required enormous physical effort and time, creating endless opportunities for families to exploit women's labor, while claiming that this work was natural, necessary, and undeserving of recognition or compensation. Cooking required hauling water, chopping wood, tending fires, and processing raw ingredients by hand. Cleaning required scrubbing with harsh soaps and primitive tools that destroyed hands and backs over years of repetitive use. Textile production, one of the few areas where women's work was economically valuable enough to be noticed, still provided no direct benefit to the women who performed it. They might spend months creating elaborate fabrics that would be sold for significant profits. But those profits belonged entirely to male family members who controlled all financial resources and decisions. The medical limitations of the era meant that many health problems that could be easily treated today became chronic sources of suffering that made daily survival even more difficult. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and made women more vulnerable to diseases that might be minor inconveniences for well-fed individuals. Repetitive stress injuries from constant manual labor caused permanent damage to joints, muscles, and bones that created lifelong pain and disability. Childbirth complications that could be prevented or treated with modern medical knowledge often resulted in permanent damage or death, creating constant terror around what should have been natural biological processes. The few medical treatments available were usually reserved for male family members or focused on conditions that affected women's ability to serve others rather than their personal comfort or well-being. Mental health issues arising from constant stress, trauma, and oppression were completely misunderstood and often blamed on moral failings, rather than recognized as natural responses to impossible circumstances. Women experiencing depression, anxiety, or other psychological distress were likely to face increased criticism and punishment rather than support or treatment, creating downward spirals that could end in complete breakdown or suicide. The social isolation imposed on married women prevented them from developing the support networks that might have helped them cope with these challenges or find alternatives to their circumstances. They were cut off from childhood friends, separated from family members who might have offered advice or assistance, and prevented from forming new relationships that might have provided emotional sustenance or practical help. This isolation was carefully maintained through restrictions on travel, communication, and social interaction that were justified as necessary for maintaining family honor and preventing women from being corrupted by inappropriate influences. The result was millions of women trapped in bubbles of misery, with no access to information, support, or hope that might have made their situations more bearable. The few women who managed to maintain connections with the outside world often did so through elaborate deceptions that required constant vigilance and carried serious risks if discovered. Secret messages might be embedded in seemingly innocent conversations or hidden in legitimate business transactions. Friendships might be maintained through coded communications that could be dismissed as harmless gossip if intercepted by family authorities. These underground networks of female solidarity were fragile and limited, but they provided crucial lifelines for women who might otherwise have been completely overwhelmed by their circumstances. They allowed for the sharing of survival strategies, emotional support, and occasionally practical assistance during the worst crises. They also preserved knowledge and wisdom that might otherwise have been lost, creating informal traditions of resistance that could be passed down through generations. The gradual accumulation of this hidden knowledge, combined with slow changes in economic conditions, technological capabilities, and social attitudes, eventually created the foundation for larger transformations in women's status and treatment. But these changes took centuries to develop and generations to implement, meaning that millions of women lived and died without experiencing any relief from the systematic oppression that defined their existence. The courage required to survive these conditions while maintaining any semblance of humanity or dignity was extraordinary by any measure. These women faced daily challenges that would break most modern people within weeks. Yet they found ways to preserve essential aspects of themselves despite constant pressure to disappear entirely into their prescribed roles as servants and breeding machines. Their stories, largely unrecorded and forgotten by official histories, represent some of the most remarkable examples of human endurance and resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization. They prove that even the most carefully designed systems of oppression cannot completely destroy the human spirit's capacity for love, hope, and resistance. And while the specific circumstances of ancient Chinese marriage may seem like distant history, the fundamental dynamics of power, control, and systematic inequality that define those relationships continue to echo through modern societies in ways that are both subtle and profound. Understanding these historical patterns helps illuminate contemporary struggles for equality, dignity, and human rights that affect millions of people around the world today. The women who endured ancient Chinese marriage weren't just victims of a cruel historical anomaly. They were human beings whose experiences reveal universal truths about oppression, resistance, and the unbreakable nature of the human desire for freedom and dignity. Their legacy lives on, not just in the changes they made possible through their quiet acts of courage, but in the reminder they provide that no system of domination, no matter how complete or justified it appears, can permanently suppress the fundamental human yearning for justice, respect, and love. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your warm bed, with your freedom to choose your partner, leave if you're unhappy, and live as an equal human being. Remember the countless women who never experienced these basic dignities, but whose strength and sacrifice helped create the world where such freedoms are possible. Their stories deserve to be told, their suffering acknowledged, and their courage celebrated, even if their names have been lost to the silence of history. Sleep well, knowing that your ability to dream of a better tomorrow is built on the foundation of women who lived their entire lives without such dreams, yet somehow found ways to plant seeds of change that would eventually blossom into the freedoms you now enjoy. Their legacy is not just survival, but the proof that human dignity cannot be permanently destroyed, no matter how systematically it is attacked.